Alright, hello everyone. Now, um, this is going to be the second part of my analysis of Cyclonopedia by Reza and Negarestani. Now, last time I talked about this book, it turned into an extremely lengthy, protracted lecture and analysis that I think lasted for about 2 hours and 30 minutes. And my initial goal, the duration of time that I'd set out beforehand for that video, was actually about 2 hours. And now this one is going to be a lot more brief. It's only going to be about 25 minutes. And I actually have a timer here to prepare me for that, to indicate that, so that when the timer goes off, I will cease recording, press the stop recording video, and then upload this video that you are watching now, ostensibly. And last time I concluded with an overview of the academic writings of Jason Babak Mohagil. And if you're wondering, I'm just going to jump straight into the analysis. If you want more of a detailed contextualization or introduction to the themes of this book, I would point you to the direction of my first video, which I uploaded about a month ago, which you can find not only on my channel, just Jordan's Analysis at Jordan's Analysis, but also on the Scorpion Movement channel at Scorpion Movement. And Scorpion Movement is actually an intellectual collective that I work with, including myself, Jacob Buczynski, who's a published author, philosopher, just overall content creator, and brilliant thinking human being, and then Flying Kabbalah, who's just another fantastic intellectual figure. And our goal is, I'd say, ultimately to theorize about modernity, technology, globalization, capitalism in a critical and perspicacious way, and the other pressing and vital issues of our time, essentially. And we draw inspiration from variegated, just myriad sources, including not just philosophy, but political science, sociology, music, art, essentially every sort of intellectual creative endeavor that one could imagine. And that's an introduction to Scorpion Movement, and I think Cyclonopedia, even though it's not an explicitly ideological book, if you actually look into it a bit deeper, as I did in my first video analysis of it, you'll see that there is a certain theme, a certain philosophical theme in terms of ruminations about the Middle East that actually align quite closely with our broader intellectual project, the Scorpion Movement. So for this second video, I actually don't have any notes laid out in front of me other than just what's on the PowerPoint. I'm going to be going mostly off the cuff here. I will upload a part 3. Actually, that will be a lot longer, probably about 1 hour, which should be enough for me to get through the remaining slides here. I think there are about 3 or 4 slides remaining in this presentation. But anyways, I digress, and let's just get started here, shall we? So I ended off with a overview of Jason Babak Mohagil's writings. Apologies if I butchered the pronunciation. It's an Iranian name, well, obviously not Jason, but the surname. And Mohagil is an Iranian-American philosopher, comparative literature scholar, Middle Eastern studies expert, and academic. And his thought is significant as it pertains to Cyclonopedia, because the key underlying element of Cyclonopedia is, like I mentioned, a sort of philosophical rumination on recent events in the Middle East, particularly geopolitical and military events, right? The war on terror, the various wars that are themselves associated with the broader war on terror, such as the war in Iraq, and now, as we've seen, with subsequent conflicts that are arguably even more devastating, such as the Syrian civil war. All of these events, rather than analyzed through the very clinical, detached, or academic lens of, say, the political scientist or the sociologist, are thrown into this mad laboratory of sorts, this whirlpool of philosophy, theology, occultism, art, the avant-garde, aesthetics, theology, together with obviously the more conventional type sort of geopolitical, global political analysis that you would expect from any discussion of the Middle East and its culture, people, warfare, etc., etc. So you have this thrilling conceptual blender Um, and on top of that blender, or rather, you should say below. After all, this book is ultimately about the subterranean. You know, if you ask anyone what is Cyclonopedia about, it's a momentous task to even answer that question in brief or succinct terms. But if they were short on time, they'd probably say, well, it's a book about the idea that oil is somehow a sentient entity that manipulates the course of human affairs for its own nefarious occult ends. And so, therefore, these conflicts in the Middle East are really occult rituals, the result of this primordial alien force, which is akin and which is likened actually by Negarestani to global capital, which theorists going back to Marx have actually described as very anti-human, very inhuman and alien in its operations, in its mode for right in its mode of revealing. It's a framing of the world, as Heidegger would call it. After all, there are key similarities between the way in which capitalism or the capitalist mindset transmutes and transfigures and perceives the world and the technological mode of being. But that's a longer discussion for perhaps a separate video. But to stick with the subterranean theme, well, there are certain underlying philosophical and theoretical lenses that Negarestani is working with in Cyclonopedia: postmodernism, Deleuzean philosophy, right? Occultism, as discussed. I find that there's a very interesting intersection with the thought of Jason Babak Mohagek, who also, as I write here, explores rising movements of world thought across both the East and West, focusing on concepts of chaos, illusion, violence, disappearance, delirium, silence, madness, apocalypse. Just a quick description of his most important book that I would say serves as a fascinating aid in understanding Cyclonopedias. This book that he published in 2015 as part of State University of New York's Global Modernity series called Insurgent, Poet, Mystic, Sectarian, Four Masks of Eastern Postmodernism. And the central thesis behind that book, to explain it simply, is that there are these four modes of subjectivity that have emerged in the Middle East over the past several decades. And when I mean subjectivity, I don't mean in the sense of subjective, um, in the sense of normative or varying from person to person based on subjective opinion. No, in the more specific philosophical terminology of the subject, that is the I that perceives the world of objects, right? We can go back to the subject-object distinction of Descartes and later thinkers like Jacobi. This is a pretty key starting point for philosophy now, especially. He and so anyway, Umahage characterizes these four modes of subjectivity that have emerged in the Middle East: the insurgent, the poet, the mystic, and sectarian. And he's actually both literal and abstract and metaphorical about this, if you can imagine that, because he does explore the activities and the ideologies and mindsets of, for instance, certain insurgents. He recalls, for example, a grim, gruesome story that came out not too long ago, maybe about 10 years, of a rebel, a fighter for the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, named Abu Sakar, or at least that was his nom de guerre. And if you're unaware, in the Syrian civil war, the Free Syrian Army was one of the first anti-Assad sort of coalition factions that emerged after the 2011 Syrian revolution, which sparked the war in the first place, the anti-Assad opposition. And there was this FSA rebel named Abu Sakar, who is now infamous because a video of him leaked where he was literally eating the heart of a Syrian Arab Army soldier, a soldier who he had viciously killed immediately prior, and whose heart had been torn from his chest and consumed by this cannibal, widely referred to as a madman. It's obviously an appropriate designation. It's this act of carnal, libidinal, rapturous madness is something that both Mohageg and Cyclonopedia are quite attracted to, and they actually view the Middle East as the epicenter of this, right? Beyond that, Mohageg explores figures like Adonis. Now, Adonis is most well known for being a key figure in which sometimes referred to as Arab modernism in modernist literature and poetry. More broadly, he's a brilliant Syrian poet and a big inspiration on my own creative work. But less known about him, or more little known, you could say, was his involvement in the Syrian Social Nationalist Party when he was a youth. When he was actually, I think a teenager or young adult, maybe in his early 20s, late teenage years, 18 to 19. And the Syrian Social Nationalist Party is a pan-Syrian nationalist group or an irredentist group in operating in not just Syria but throughout the broader Levant region, including Lebanon, Palestine to a lesser extent due to the severity and degree of the Israeli occupation there. And they propagate this revolutionary irredentist ideology where they think that the true will of the Syrian people can only be restored once they come into power. And I will talk about their ideology in greater detail when I actually get to the next slide here in regards to some of the recent political developments in the Middle East. So those are examples of the insurgent, the poet, obviously, Adonis functions, serves that role as well. The mystic, he talks about specifically Iranian cinema, Iranian New Wave cinema, and the very mystical qualities it possesses of these atemporal, almost ontological categories and qualities. The films are very slow, they're almost drunken in their slowness. They seem to be beyond time, beyond space. They utilize very interesting camera work as if affecting or assuming the mode of ritualistic, mystical practices from eons ago, and the sectarian, which is, essentially the extremist, the fighter, the militant warrior that we've seen time and time again dominate discussions of Middle Eastern political, cultural, and even intellectual life. And those four aspects of the Middle East that we've seen emerge recently, not just since the start of the War on Terror and the 2001 September 11th attacks, but even predating those events, antedating those events. And it's those very forces that Negarestani explores with such brilliance and with such intensity in Cyclonopedia. As I write here, in its unique interdisciplinary insight on the Middle East, Mawaqeg's works allow us to attain a deeper understanding of what Negarestani is trying to say about the region in this book. Now, as I mentioned in my last lecture on Negarestani, on Cyclonopedia, I think that far too many people have zeroed in on the fictional elements of the book, and specifically the cosmic horror elements, the idea that oil is this sentient entity, it's primordial, chthonic, that animates human affairs in this occult supernatural way. I think people have hyper-focused on that. As a result, they've arrived at this very flawed and almost naive reading of Cyclonopedia as a book that's primarily focused on energy politics, that's warning us just against the dangers of over-reliance on and the exploitation of these energy resources, especially in the Middle East. That's a very basic early 2000s leftist kind of reading, and I think there's something much deeper to this book than that reading, right? As I write here, the sentient oil thesis or underpinning of Dr. Persani's manuscripts and writings on occult forces animating events in the Middle East really hint at a broader philosophical perspective on the nature of Middle Eastern thought and terrorism and insurgency, particularly in contrast to the West, modernity, rationalism, etc. All of these different types of activities that we see in the Middle East, actually, and not only in the Middle East, right? Obviously insurgencies have taken root in far-flung corners of the world, right? I don't want to go down the entire list because it's just too extensive to even cover in a single video, let alone one with the time constraints, such time constraints as the one I'm recording right now. But we have the Zapatistas in Mexico in the 1990s, and they're still active today, actually, in controlling large parts of territory, large territories in the south, in the Chiapas region, for instance. And the Modern Insurgent, actually, which is a great burgeoning conflict journalism organization, just did a great report on the Zapatistas actually to kick off this year, 2024, they sent their reporters to interview the Zapatistas in person. It was highly fascinating. I recommend that anyone who's watching this check that out. The Zapatistas are an example. The individuals tending to the wild, a very fascinating and somewhat obscure group, heavily inspired by the writings and practices of Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber. And they have this radical anti-modern, anti-technology ideology that they instantiate and incarnate through and propagate through attacks on, for example, nanotechnology centers, research centers, and universities in Mexico, which they view as perpetuating the process of technological hegemony. Um, those are just two very influential and very powerful groups in Mexico alone. Now imagine in every other country, right? Of course, there aren't insurgencies in every other country, but you have countless in Africa. Um, there's war happening in Ukraine right now, in Eastern Europe, not too far from the very heart of Europe, right? We know that Ukraine borders several EU states, NATO member states. So that's all well and good, but there's a certain fervency and frequency of insurgent and terrorist activity that we see in the Middle East that in comparison to every other region simply pales before it, and it appears far less significant. I actually write about this, for example, in my recent book, which is forthcoming. It's slated for release this year. Actually, I think it's going to be highly interesting. It's a really a compilation of my writings and nonfiction pieces on various topics, from world politics to philosophy to technology, capitalism, globalization, modernity, World War III, artificial intelligence, transhumanism, insurgency. Pretty much everything you can think about. Everything that I've been interested in since I was a little child is distilled and instilled. Not instilled, distilled and instantiated in this single book. So that's going to be exciting. But anyways, in the about fourth or fifth essay of the book, has the tentative title of "On the Age of Terror," I actually start the essay off like this. I write how it seems as if the arc of history and of human affairs for you could say, past couple of decades has underwent a dramatic alteration. Because before, Europe, in a sense, used to be considered almost the capital of the world. I know that's generally granted. That's a title that's generally bestowed upon New York City in America, but I view this in a more cultural and philosophical sense. Even the aspects and qualities of New York City that are responsible for its very designation as the capital of the world in the first place are really originally European qualities, and specifically Western European qualities that first prefigured the hegemonic ideology and practices of the broader Western world itself, which is Western in the sense that it's Occidental. It derives from Western Europe, and would actually come to mark the birth of the Western world in a sense. And we know that through colonialism and imperialism, these Western ideals were propagated and proliferated throughout the world. And I do believe actually that even though the official apparatuses of imperialist subjugation have mostly been dissolved, the legal and juridical apparatuses, they've really been sublated, as Hegel would say in the Hegelian sense, into this much more disquieting and disturbing, yet far more imperceptible, at first glance at least, version, this form or mode. We live in a new age of cultural imperialism, right? And it's really the propagation of Western culture that spreads its tentacles into the far-flung nooks and crannies of the world, always in search of a host, like a parasite, you could say. That is the direction and the flow of finance capital which animates Western life. And granted, or considering that Europe is the source of all of that, Europe is the West in a sense. That's where the West originates from. We know it's expanded technically, geographically beyond Europe. It's quite fascinating. It's quite important then that it seems as if Europe is no longer most important region in terms of world affairs, in terms of global politics. John Mearsheimer, for example, who's a leading realist scholar. Realism is a interesting theoretical lens in international relations theory that views political actors as self-interested agents operating in a anarchic world system that will constantly seek to maximize their power and material gain at the expense of others. It's a very Machiavellian system. Machiavelli actually is one of the intellectual progenitors of realism. But anyways, I might make a video in the future talking more in depth about realist theory. Ideally, I would like to interview Mearsheimer or any of the other major contemporary exponents of IO realism for the Scorpion Movement podcast. People like Robert Pape, Stephen Walt, etc. But anyways, John Mearsheimer is a leading realist, political science and IR scholar. He's actually famous for stating that he said very succinctly in a very casual and blunt way, he said, Europe doesn't really matter anymore. Europe is basically a giant museum. The full quote is, Europe doesn't really matter anymore. Europe is basically a giant museum, end quote. And he's referring to the former preponderance of Europe in human affairs as a whole. And when he says that it resembles a graveyard of humanity in a sense, means all of these the major historical events, not all of them, but the most of them, of the 20th, 19th, 18th century, 17th centuries, have either originated from or been dominated by Europe, European peoples, civilization, state actors, state and non-state actors alike. And that's not actually a normative statement, right? He's not saying that this European hegemony was a positive force. I mean, I think it's blatantly obvious that it wasn't. Colonialism, imperialism led to the deaths of countless peoples, and I think more so than that, led to the spiritual annihilation and humiliation and subordination of countless third world peoples from around the world. I mean, I recall Frantz Fanon, for instance, writing about the psychological and philosophical impacts of colonization on the colonized people. How it robs them of the fundamental desire for recognition, to the point where we're not even speaking here of the master-slave dialectic. We haven't even reached Hegelianism yet, because the master does not recognize the slave whatsoever in this case. With that being said, we see then in the 20th century the increasing progression of the legal and juridical system, right? And, Kojev writes about this, for instance. Whereas in the past, in pre-modern times, it was very difficult for the average person, for the masses, mass society. And I know that many scholars like people like Benedict Anderson or Ernest Geller, the modernist theorists of nationalism, would dispute my use of mass society in reference to pre-modern developments because they say that it's only associated with modernity. I'm just using it in a more general sense of common society, the commoners, the everyman of society, right? Those people in the pre-modern era, so prior to modernization, industrialization, would generally find it very difficult to fulfill this desire for recognition that Hegel and similar thinkers characterize as being so fundamental, if not the foremost drive of the human being, is the desire for recognition. And Hegel proposed that this could be fulfilled. For instance, he outlines this in the Philosophy of Right. He proposes that this could be fulfilled through the Sittlichkeit, which roughly, it's a German word, and it roughly translates to the ethical life, through the social community, right, the family, the state, certain civic institutions, right, which I would argue actually contravenes the direction in which the modern state form would go later on. That's a longer discussion. But prior to modernity, we had these systems of feudal overlordship. We had monarchic domination that resulted in a great majority of the populace in these disparate polities and communities of human society having a very subordinate and passive role. right? They were exploited, overworked, subjugated. I can imagine that led to a lot of existential dread on their behalf. Because when you're in this subordinate position, you don't just uh, feel bad out of these, some psychological processes where you just wish, you feel jealousy, or you wish like you wish that you were the superior, that you were the one conquering or subjugating others. But there's actually an abundance of recent evidence, empirical evidence, that's been published in scientific journals indicating that one's status in the social hierarchy, the human social hierarchy, has a tremendous impact on their mental health. And not just on their mental health, but on their physical health as well, through direct physiological processes. And that's related most likely to evolutionary mechanisms. I think evolutionary psychology and sociobiology, researchers working in those two fields are making tremendous progress on this as we speak. But what they found is that when we perceive a threat to our status, to our existential selves, to what we represent as a self, right? Because we have to imagine, for the existentialist, a key focus or foci of obsession, of rumination, is the idea of the authentic self that will always have these societal backdrop pressures, das Man, as Heidegger would call it. But regardless, it's a far more noble and difficult path to follow one's authentic self, right? So keeping this idea in mind, we feel that when one either disrespects our authentic self, refuses to recognize it, or worse, threatens to dominate it, when our authentic self is rendered or conceived of as others as inferior, when we're humiliated and downgraded in the social hierarchy, when we even detect these domination threats, these threats to our status, certain physiological responses are almost immediately induced. I mean, it's almost a causal process. I write and speak about the flaws of the causal worldview, the causal mechanistic worldview of materialism that I think far too many scientists erroneously propagate and adhere to. But they are correct in this one respect, at least, that when we detect threats to our status in the social hierarchy, in the dominance hierarchy, certain physiological responses follow, right? And they're varied, but they can include palpitations, increased heart rate, sweating, this omnipresent anxiousness and nervousness, which is actually deeply linked to physiological processes. It's not just psychological, right? Because that the brain sends neurotransmitters that affect these emotions and cause them to even occur in the first place. That is, if one takes a materialist reading of things. But yet palpitations, tremors, sweating, perhaps a reddening or a bloating of certain, swelling of certain parts of the body. These have all been proven by scientists to be natural, inherent reactions to perceived or legitimate threats to our status in the social hierarchy. So, for example, when someone is superior at us at something, when someone's better than us, stronger than us, faster than us, more physically attractive than us, any sort of index or indicator of superiority, we experience those physiological reactions. Now, I think that it's most likely an evolutionary mechanism that, dating all the way back to the era of hunter-gatherer times, pre-modern times, when people that were superior than us could actually represent a significant threat, because they could easily kill us. Members of a foreign tribe that appeared to be superior could kill us. They could rob our resources, our mates, right? So they represented an existential threat of the utmost sort to our very survival, right? To our existence, hence the term existential threat. And the reason that all of that is important, these new developments in evolutionary psychology and sociobiology is because, if anything, they vindicate ideas that philosophers have had for centuries, centuries predating the emergence at all, the initial emergence of fields like evolutionary psychology and sociobiology. Once again, the philosophers are vindicated, right? Um, People like Hegel and Kojève. Kojève is a follower of Hegel in a sense. He's a Russian Hegelian who also influences Deleuze. It's often said that Deleuze reads reads Hegel through Kojève. But it reminds me of how, we had the scientific revolution in the 17th century, and Newton revolutionized physics, displaced and superseded Aristotelian uh, physics with his causal and mechanistic model, right? That was predicated on a notion of absolute time. So there's a physical time that exists independently of human experience, right? Um, but Kant actually um, strongly disputes that. He says, just no, that's not the case, right? Even if that was the case, we wouldn't be able to have access to that time through our own perception. And so from there, he regards time actually as nothing more than something that we humans impose on the world to make sense of it. It appeals to our rationality. It's intertwined with reason, and that would be part of the phenomenal world, right? That's where the term phenomenology comes from. The phenomenal world is the world as it appears to us, and then the noumenal will be things in themselves that Kant says we can never really have access to, right? And at the time, Kant was the philosopher, not really the scientist. Newton was the actual technical scientist, but recent developments in physics have actually vindicated Kant, not Newton. I was just talking with a physicist friend of mine recently who was talking about how now physicists have actually arrived at the notion, contemporary physicists, that yes, there is no such thing as absolute physical time. It's actually relative in nature. So that's a bit of physics for you. But that marks the end of the time slot that I've allotted for this video. Now, I didn't really get to the later slides just because I wanted to provide a lot of contextualization. It's extremely important for my analysis of Cyclonopedia. But next video will be a much longer analysis. The third video in this tripartite series. It will be the final one, so it'll probably be about an hour long, perhaps a little bit longer. I'll finish up this slide, get into the Hegel's master-slave dialectic, Kojève's reading of Hegel's master-slave dialectic, the progression of modernity, the transition from the pre-modern to the modern period, the legal and juridical processes that facilitated that have resulted in a resolution of the master-slave dialectic in the form of the universal homogeneous state, how that's connected to the West, how that derives from the West, defining terms like West, capitalism, modernity, rationalism, and contrasting that with terrorism, insurgency, Middle Eastern thought, which is quite radical, and as we can see here with Mohagig, radical extremist in nature, and how that contravenes and transgresses the homogeneous state, and how that's exactly what Negarestani is getting at in Cyclonopedia more deeply. Then we're going to get some Baudrillard, some geopolitical analysis, dangers of painting the Middle East with a broad brush, talking about the necessity of differentiating between the myriad political and cultural actors in the Middle East, just so that we don't paint them all with a broad brush, some theoretical principles here, and then on a more literary basis, or not literary, but structural basis, an analysis of the actual structure of the book itself, culminating in some final commonalities and similarities for the films from the new French extremity scene, of which in particular Negarestani cites the film of Claire Denis, but I will also focus on the French film Martyrs, released in 2008, which I think is quite interesting. It has some interesting philosophical themes. And that about wraps it up for this video. If you enjoyed, like and subscribe, leave a comment, let me know what you'd like me to cover next, and I will see you the next time for part 3 of this video analysis. Thank you, bye.